If you're here after watching my first video explaining why Dune is such a mysteriously captivating story, then you're in the right place. And why that? Well, simply because I'm not done talking about the greatness of Dune. In fact, no, it's more than that. It's sublimity, that strange feeling, almost fear, that overwhelms you after discovering this universe. Speaking of universes, Dune is what we call a space opera. That is, a sci-fi story set in space with adventures and often epic battles. But in reality, Dune is not just a space opera. It's more than that. Dune is a symphony of everything we love about sci-fi. The trope of a galactic empire and a corrupt emperor, see Star Wars. Genetic selection, see Gattaca. The invention of an entire new culture that doesn't exist in real life, a la Avatar. And the trope of the Chosen One, who falls but has superpowers, see Anakin or Neo in Matrix. How on earth can a mix of that be bad? A mix of all these brilliant masterpieces is hard not to enjoy. And there is something else. Space opera is a genre that has rarely been adapted well. And why is that? Well, because making such masterpieces is not only about budget, but also about feasibility, and even more than that, a creative vision, audacious and singular.
And that is power.
In fact, there is a reason Dune has been called unadaptable. It's a risky bet. But guess what? Denis Villeneuve has accepted that challenge, fully aware that adaptations of this kind hardly find their audience. And we've seen films that didn't find their audience, like John Carter or Valerian. But there is something else. When you watch Dune, it's impossible not to think of Star Wars. The similarities are just everywhere. A Chosen One, Paul Atreides in Dune, Anakin Skywalker in Star Wars, a mystical force, the Bene Gesserit versus the Jedi's Force, desert planets, Arrakis and Tatooine, a hero who ends up doing something terrible while trying to save someone, with Paul trying to secure his people's future and Anakin wanting to save Padme. I mean, even iconic lines about fear.
Fear's the mind killer. Fear is the path to the dark side.
We understand that George Lucas, who is behind Star Wars, took inspiration from Dune. But before Dune, there was another work about war, the desert, and a messianic figure. The film is set during World War I, a period when the Ottoman Empire controlled much of the Middle East. The British wanted to weaken Ottoman power and used growing Arab nationalism to push local leaders to revolt against colonial rule. And then enters Thomas Edward Lawrence, a British officer who was fascinated by the Arab culture, was sent to Arabia to help the British in their ambitions. His job was to bring the Arab tribes together to fight the Ottomans. But as Lawrence spends time with the Arabs, he becomes deeply connected to their culture. He leads them in key military victories, including the famous assault of Aqaba, and earns a godlike status as their leader. But ironically, despite leading a revolution against colonial oppression, Lawrence ultimately became an instrument of British imperial strategy. After falling in love with the culture and its people, leading them in a revolution against colonialism, and after being seen as their messiah, Lawrence ultimately ends up perpetuating a new form of colonial domination. Well, can you see the similarities? Both Lawrence and Paul arrive in the desert world and become part of the local culture. Both are seen as heroes and influenced communities. Both heroes make mistakes. Lawrence believed he was helping, but his actions ultimately reinforced the oppression he wanted to end. Similarly, Paul tries to help his people, but ends up causing more conflict rather than ending them. Actually, Paul is, like Lawrence, a strategic leader. And here comes Herbert's brilliance. Herbert wanted to show the dangers of blindly following charismatic leaders. Like in the real story of Lawrence of Arabia, he uses the idea of a hero to show that following these leaders, as good as they seem to be, can sometimes be dangerous. But Herbert's brilliance doesn't stop at creating a desert world that resonates with human history. During the Cold War, the Middle East's oil reserves were as strategically important as the spice in Dune, with major countries fighting for control, much like the noble houses fighting to dominate Arrakis. But now, why did I mention Lawrence of Arabia? Well, beyond the geopolitical parallels, the connection is deeper. Like Herbert's Dune, Lean's film explores the complexities of leadership, colonial interests, and the consequences of power struggles. And all that in the desert! But Lawrence of Arabia did more than just tell a compelling story. It revolutionized epic filmmaking, redefining what a great and epic movie should be. It's no wonder Lawrence of Arabia is a reference point for everyone, for Spielberg, Scorsese, and even Villeneuve himself.
I vividly remember I was probably 19 years old, being alone in a theater in Montreal and watching in 70 millimeters Lawrence of Arabia. That screening changed my life. Lawrence of Arabia is to cinema what the pyramids are to architecture. I mean, it's like a masterpiece, it's timeless, and you could not make it again today.
And so now, those who saw Lawrence of Arabia understand more and more the greatness of Denis Dune. But there is more to it than that. If it were only the story that made the film a masterpiece, then we wouldn't be talking about a film, or about cinema at all. Because, let's be honest, we can all agree that what makes Dune so fascinating is also the aesthetic shock the movie leaves on the audience. First of all, Denis takes us seriously by proposing real landscapes. This authenticity truly brings Arrakis to life. The images depict a vibrant desert through its bright and warm colors, animated by its fauna and inhabitants. The emphasis, is placed on the vastness of the landscapes rather than the characters. We can notice this because they play with scales. In many scenes, humans appear as tiny figures compared to the greatness of the desert. By positioning the characters within their environment this way, it paradoxically draws attention to them, as they are the small, moving shapes within the immense desert. This visual gigantism makes the audience feel the smallness of humanity in the vastness of the universe. This kind of incommensurability can also be noticed through the representations of smallness. Like the features of Alia, these are representations that exceed reason. Inside, this kind of sense of awe is felt through the images, yes, but also through the music and the sounds. Admit it, this lyrical flight gives you goosebumps, shaking you deep inside. This music, in a single composition, captures beauty, fidelity, joy, love, and tragedy. On the other hand, we have the Harkonnen sounds, which evoke monstrous dread and awe. The long notes create a palpable tension, altering our breath, sometimes slowing it in anticipation, then quickening it under the weight of anxiety. Some of the sounds, through their dissonance, unstable tone, harsh, strident noise, especially the violins, and their irregular and repetitive rhythms, immerse us in a psychedelic universe. Sometimes, the music seems to evoke sensations similar to the effects of illicit substance, thus illustrating the madness of the Harkonnens. The creativity required to design these atmospheres is insane. The composers have gone as far as to transform instruments beyond their conventional purposes and to invent new ones.
Something I wanted to always do, to invent instruments that don't exist, invent sounds that don't exist.
And whoa, every sound makes the world of Arrakis and Dune feel alive. The sandworms, the footsteps, the sound of the shields, the ornithopters. We almost feel like we can hear the sand in some music. And then listen to these sounds. We know they don't exist, but yet they are inexplicably recognizable. They sound exactly like you'd expect objects from Arrakis to sound. It's familiar, and yet you know it's something you could never hear on Earth. And actually, that's the point. These are real sounds, but modified.
The whole process was, let's make new sounds.
The noises of the ornithopters, for example, are a mixture, somewhere between a purring sound and the fluttering of a beetle. And now, we understand why the sound designers won the Oscar for Best Sound Mixing in 2022. The desert becomes almost tangible, palpable, because these sounds are in some way familiar. It's this mix between the unknown and the known that makes the world of Arrakis both mysterious and captivating. But this greatness also comes from somewhere else. The crowd. The characters evolve with an immense mass, much larger than themselves. This shows that their actions and their consequences are beyond them. As the story progresses, the crowd supporting Poe keeps growing. This rise mirrors somehow his ascent to power over the Empire, marking the affirmation of his charisma and destinies. Increasingly confident, Poe fully realizes that what he foresees will inevitably happen. Doubt no longer has a place. The crowd grows, cheers him, elevates him. Carried by this fervor, he becomes a symbol, and every voice chanting his name seals more and more his fate. Little adapted to reasoning, crowds, on the contrary, are quick to act. The crowds act according to Paul's will. Unable to self-organize, the crowd needs a leader. And politicians have understood this very well. The power of the crowd and the art of influencing it, well, this can be found in dictatorships, yes, but even in democracies. Look at the speeches of Churchill, Roosevelt, or even de Gaulle. But nevertheless, a crowd can be used for both good and evil. David Lynch also took a risky bet when attempting to adapt Dune. Unfortunately, the film did not speak to everyone, but at least it taught him a lesson.
Do you regret making it?
Yes, except it just nailed this idea, never, ever do a film without Final Cut.
Can I ask you why you considered Dune a disappointment?
Dune, I didn't have Final Cut on. It's the only film I've made that I didn't have. I didn't technically have Final Cut on The Elephant Man, but Mel Brooks gave it to me. And on Dune, I started selling out even in the script phase, knowing I didn't have Final Cut, and I sold out. So it was a slow dying the death and a terrible, terrible experience.
In fact, there is a story that not many people know. After months of tumultuous filming due to technical issues, Lynch finally completed his version of the film. The problem? It was around 3 hours and a half long, far exceeding the studio's expectations for a commercially viable runtime. To make it more commercially viable, the studio took away Lynch's final cut and shortened it. The result? A film with a disjoint, truncated, and incoherent edit. But if it didn't reach everyone, it's also because it's pure Lynchian cinema. Anxiety, narrative ambiguity, strangeness, disturbing characters, exploration of the unconscious, and duality. These are all Lynchian traits that can be disturbing to some, but yet, in the end, we can all agree that Lynch has left his mark on cinema. In the end, these two adaptations of Dune by Villeneuve and Lynch show that the story can be approached in many different ways, which proves that Dune has earned a place as a reference for the greatest directors and can speak to anyone, revolutionizing sci-fi.